Bears and porridge pots. I find myself standing outside the door, debating whether to knock or to run. Once upon a time, there lived a young maiden and her grandmother, who spent their days locked away in a dungeon of a merciless lard's castle. The grandmother was a known witch, and had taken her granddaughter on as her protégée. The two had been captured and sentenced to death, but the lady of the house took pity on the elderly woman and the young maiden, and made her husband promise to spare their lives. He agreed on a condition they become working members of his household, and were watched at all times by designated guards before returning to their dungeon cell to retire each night. The grandmother was given the job of a kitchen wench, and her granddaughter Orsa became a housemaid. The master of the house, the Honourable Brocken, the only son of the lard and lady, took a liking to Orsa. The two were close in age, stature, and mind. Though Orsa was forbidden to speak to Brocken, they still continued to exchange looks from across the room and created their own hidden language consisting of blinks and twitches. One day, as the lard was preparing for his hunt, Brocken approached him and asked if he could join, thinking himself ready. The lard was uncertain, but with the encouragement of his close friend, a local baron, he agreed, and the trio set out into the forest. Orsa was prescribed to go with the party, as she was to be the wine carrier, a job she wouldn't be doing if the actual wine bearer hadn't gone and drunk from his own supply. Orsa delighted in being outside for once. Despite there being a chill in the air, she lapped it up, savouring every moment and paying little mind to the party she was travelling with, only giving them the occasional tipple when asked. When it came time for Brocken to shoot his first arrow and take down a bear scratching its back against a tree, he hesitated. He'd never hunted before, let alone killed a creature, and a bear was arguably a rather cruel challenge to bestow upon his young soldiers. There was no surprise when the arrow flew right past the bear somewhere far off into the woodland. "Your lad can't shoot for toffee. Why, I bet that little lady could shoot 10 times better than he could ever dream." The baron gestured over to Orsa, who was admiring a small pink butterfly resting on her index finger. "My son will be an excellent shot in time. You took a fortnight to learn, did you not?" The lard taunted his friend. "Still, it'd be quite a sight." The baron nodded towards Orsa. The lard thought on this for a moment and called Orsa over to his side. The maid had lifted the jug ready, but the lard asked her to put it down and thrust a bow into her hands. Orsa stared at the contraption with a gulp. She had no idea how to sew, let alone shoot an arrow, but the lard insisted she give it a go for his amusement. Orsa looked over to Brocken, who blinked twice at her in a statement of reassurance. After being shown how to set up the arrow and where to place her fingers, Orsa pulled the string back towards her and whispered that the wind allow her shot to be swift and true. The arrow shimmered for a moment, so short that nobody noticed, and then Orsa shot her arrow directly into the bear's heart. The baron burst into a round of applause, and Brocken smiled triumphantly at Orsa, but the lard was not best pleased. A servant girl being a better shot than his noble-blooded heir was a wound too heavy to bear. He yelled at the maiden and accused her of using witchcraft to hit his target. This was of course true, but nobody, not even Orsa herself, knew it at the time. As punishment, the lard decided that the maiden and her grandmother both finally served their sentences first thing in the morning. By the time the sun rose, they would be dead. The two women were left in their cell, hungry and cold, huddled up together for warmth. Brocken showed mercy on them by visiting the dungeon with a large fur blanket shrouded over his arms. He handed it through the bars, where Orsa retrieved it gratefully. She offered it to her grandmother, but the old lady insisted she use it for herself. Knowing she couldn't say no to her grandmother, Orsa nodded, sat down and laid the fur across her legs. "It's from the bear you slew," Brocken smiled. "You should have it by right." He looked over to the grandmother as she approached. She whispered something to him that Orsa didn't quite catch, but he went away with a smile and returned half an hour later with a large, empty blue and white bowl. The guards raised an eyebrow at the exchange, but having guarded the two women for a while, they built enough of a rapport to want them to be comfortable for their last hours, however that may be. The grandmother placed the bowl down in the middle of the room and taught Orsa a quick spell to produce porridge. You would simply whisper to the pot, "Cook, little pot, cook." And when you had enough, you'd say, "Stop, little pot, stop." Orsa waited for her grandmother to finish her bowl before saying the words, "Cook, little pot, cook." Just as she did, the lard came storming down the stairs. "What is the meaning of this?" he bellowed. Brocken tried to explain, but the lard dismissed him from his presence. Also tried to tell the pot to stop, but every time she went to open her mouth, the lard berated her. The porridge doubled with every growth, and it wasn't long before the bowl shattered under the weight of the porridge. Within moments, the porridge began filling the room. Orsa threw her fur over her shoulders and immediately became a bear. The lard tried to escape, but he was swept up in the great porridge flood, as was Orsa's grandmother. Being a bear allowed her body to withstand far more weight than the average human, and she was able to easily free herself from her cage and swim her way up the stairs. Everyone was terrified to see a bear coming towards them, but they didn't have enough time to acknowledge it before being swept away by the sweet porridge. Orsa found Brocken and his mother in the dining room, where she scooped them up and made her way outside. Some guards, who were tasked with protecting the lady, fought Orsa and freed the lady from her, only to also be swept up by the porridge. Brocken wasn't afraid of Orsa, not after she used their secret language to explain what had happened. When they were a safe distance away, she stripped off of her fur and returned to her maiden form. The two ran off into the woods together to make their own house, freed from the shackles of others telling them what to do. They lived together gaily for several years in a quiet cottage before Orsa had their first and only child, a babe named Ben. During this time, Orsa cut her fur into 3 pieces, giving one to her husband and the other to Ben, allowing them all to become bears for their own protection. One often finds they need protection when living near the forest. One morning, the family donned their furs and went out to catch some salmon in the stream. Before she left, Orsa placed out 3 bowls of porridge, each fashioned from a broken piece of the original porridge pot, which had been recovered from the ruins of the castle some time ago. Orsa filled each bowl to everyone's liking and left them to cool down, ready for when they returned with the fresh salmon they wanted to top it with. As they left, my sister watched on from behind a tree. Goldie was a caring girl. She couldn't sit around and watch father struggle to earn his keep, or mother deal with her newfound poverty. She knew the bear family had come from a wealthy place, and she hoped taking and selling some of their luxuries would return us to a better social standing. Goldie wasted no time in breaking into the bear's house. As daughters of a locksmith, we became well educated in the craft of locksmithery, and that included picking them. Once she was inside, the first thing she spotted was the 3 bowls of porridge sitting on the table. She couldn't resist plunging her hands into the first bowl she saw and scoffing it down. It was an instant regret, because the second stone-cold oats touched her lips, she spluttered them back out. "Who enjoys their porridge cold?" She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and poked her finger into the leftmost bowl of the morbid curiosity, to see if it too was freezing. She retracted it immediately and soothed her red-throbbing finger by sucking on it. "Who enjoys their porridge scalding?" she sighed as the sting of heat eased back down. For the third and last bowl, Goldie didn't dare stick her fingers in. Instead, she fetched a spoon from off the counter and placed that into the meal instead. She took a curious nibble from it and hummed with delight. Not only was the porridge not too cold or too hot, but it was the most delicious meal she'd had in weeks. I must admit, I'm jealous, because at the same time and same moment, I was stuck up home, gnawing on an unripe acorn. After filling herself with porridge, she decided to rest in the sitting corner of the cottage. There were 3 chairs to choose from. Each she tested by pushing the palm of her hand down on a seat. For the first one, she found her palm scratched by a broken spring. For the second, it sank so far into the pillowy cushion she feared it would never be retrieved. But the last and smallest chair was just the right size for my sister's butt. If only she weren't too heavy for it. You see, the chair was built for a baby, not a teenage girl, and her butt made quick work of breaking the wood beneath it. With a sore bottom and a bruised ego, my sister stumbled around the cottage, resuming her mission of finding valuables to steal. The bears, despite coming from wealth, through the Papa Bear's line, had little to nothing to steal. Goldie was now frustrated on top of her other casualties and retired temporarily to the largest bed in the bears' shared bedroom. It was lumpy and hard, but living in poverty adjusts you to such things, and she quickly found herself asleep. When the bears returned with their mouths filled with salmon and gurgling stomachs, they were horrified to see that their porridges had been touched. Bears have good noses, and once dropping his salmon on the table, Brocken made quick work of sniffing out Goldie in his bed. My sister screamed bloody murder when she was faced with a large bear and prepared to run, but Brocken threw off his fur and stood before her in the form of a man. He pulled her by the ear out of the cottage and dragged her to the village, followed by his wife and child. The village was wounded by Goldie's actions and had her publicly and brutally punished. She survived the torture, but she did not survive her injuries. Now I've returned to that cottage on behalf of myself and my sister, having buried my daughter wrapped in her cloak with the hope of finding closure. Before I set out on my journey to find remedy for Little Red's death, I needed to see for myself that the Bear family was sorry for the trauma they'd inflicted upon myself and my parents. Soon I find myself standing outside the door, debating whether to knock or to run. But my question is answered for me as a tall and handsome man opens the door. I recognise his face immediately, to be that of Ben, the once baby bear. And he in turn recognises me, or at least he recognises my sister within me. I haven't been able to shake your face from my nightmares, he tells me as we sit opposite each other at the same table my sister stole porridge from. That was my sister's face, I remind him, and he nods. Yes, of course, Miss Goldilocks. My parents never could live with what they did to her. He strokes their furs, laying in the middle of the table, as if they were some decorative pieces. I ask if they took their own lives, and he shakes his head. No, they just died of old age. Bears don't live as long as humans, and hybrids live half as much. He points to himself, noting how he is already middle-aged. I find his words cold and insulting, though I know I shouldn't. But if they truly couldn't live with themselves, why did they wait for death to take them naturally? I ask him if he regrets what happened. I know he was just a babe at the time, but if my sister had any imprint on his family, as he so claims, he must feel something for her. She was a thief. She received what she deserved, though it is unfortunate she passed away from her injuries. I was furious. I lunged at him, landing flat on top of the table, winding myself. As I pulled myself up, I grabbed hold of the fur to steady myself. Without a second thought, I threw it on and became a bear. It was an odd sensation. My mind raced to thoughts of honey and salmon. The thoughts of eating fish made my stomach turn. I haven't eaten any living creatures for decades. Ben threw on the other fur, and the two of us wrestled, knocking over everything in the kitchen. After a good 5 minutes, I found myself laying on top of him. He looked up at me with hunger in his eyes, and we stripped from our fur and from our robes. As he slept on the floor of the kitchen, I gathered my belongings, cursed to the gods, and grabbed the fur from the ground. As I headed towards the door, I noticed one of the magic porridge pots and decided to take it too, wrapping it in my fur. I looked back at Ben with a pang of regret. This man had spoken ill of my sister, and I bedded him. More like I floored him. Perhaps I'm not handling my grief quite as well as I thought. The sooner I return my daughter to me, the better.